A twist front sewing pattern might look scary, but this video will tell you what you need to know to make it easier than you ever thought possible. Hi sewing friend, this is Tessa from Love Notions, and I'm here today to talk about our twist front sewing pattern. I love a good twist front top. They tend to make me feel like very comfortable. That twist is just so fun and unique. It makes such a statement, and it kind of draws attention to that instead of my midsection, which I typically don't showcase. So when it comes to today's sewing pattern, I really love how quick and surprisingly easy it can actually be. So the twist front sewing pattern that we're talking about today is the Love Notions Lotus Blossom Blouse. It was actually just recently updated, and now it includes sizes extra small to 5X. It includes sizes extra small to 5X, as well as includes a done-for-you full bust adjustment. It also now has an option for armbands to finish off the sleeves with even more polish. And of course, it features just a really pretty twist at the lower portion of the pattern near to the hemline. So there's a couple things that you need to know about this twist front pattern that are just going to help make your sewing process go a lot easier and give you just a little bit more sewing confidence. Because I think we all know that knowledge is power, right? So before we get into the 3 things that you should know about sewing the Lotus Blossom Blouse, here's some other things that you might want to know about the Lotus update and the re-release for this pattern. So for this weekend only, in honor of its re-release, you can get Lotus for just $5. And that's just to celebrate our update, as well as give you even more of an opportunity to grab this really easy to wear and easy to sew pattern. This pattern, the Lotus Blossom Blouse, also has a version for kids in sizes 2T to 16, and that is also a really fabulous make. It's just very easy, very versatile, and it's just an interesting and unique sewing project. So now let's get into it. Let's talk about a couple of things that are important to know before you sew the Lotus Blossom Blouse. As with many sewing patterns, certain techniques or features, they really seem scary until you actually do them yourself or you see them being done. And that was absolutely the case for me with Lotus Blossom. We kind of psych ourselves up about it, and then it becomes like this whole big thing. And then when we do the scary thing, we learn from it, we make maybe a few mistakes, and then we get there. And then we just like bust out a whole bunch of them in an afternoon, right? So let's talk about those 3 things that you need to know before you sew the Lotus Blossom Blouse. First of all, let's talk fabric. This twist front top can work with lots of fabrics, but the originally intended fabric for this design is very specific. If you want to make the pattern per the original intended design, you're going to want to look for a fabric that is the same on the front and the back sides, a double-sided fabric. So here is a visual of the actual front pattern piece. So you see how it's one big, huge piece? So we're going to actually be twisting it at the middle, and then when we fold it together, the exterior of one side will be the technical right side, and the exterior of the other side will technically be the wrong side of the fabric. So if you've been sewing for any amount of time, you probably know that most fabrics have a wrong side and a right side. And the right side, maybe it's like maybe a little more smooth, maybe it has a printed design on it, or more of a saturated color on it. And then the wrong side of the fabric is typically something with maybe more texture or loops, and often if it's a printed fabric, it has a completely different color. For example, most colorfully printed double brush polys have a completely white wrong side. So for the Lotus Blossom Blouse, that is if you want to make it in the original way, you're going to need to try to find a fabric that is very similar or exactly the same on the front and the back sides. So I've compiled a few fabrics that I found that work really well for Lotus, and they have both the same right side and the same wrong side. Okay, so those were some of the examples of fabrics that often work really well for the original version of Lotus. However, you should also know that if you can't get a double-sided fabric, you could totally use kind of like a regular type of fabric for Lotus, one that has a clear right side and a very clear wrong side. So all you're going to need to do in those cases is to piece that big giant pattern piece. So you're just going to cut the pattern piece right through the center. You're going to add in a 3/8 seam allowance, and then you're going to sew those two big pieces together. And in this way, you'll get that same effect as the original. There'll just be a seam allowance there. So this way does give just a little bit of a different look, but it is hardly noticeable. So there's another option for you when it comes to fabric. So what's the second thing that you should know before diving into this Lotus Blossom Blouse sewing project? And that's about the neckline. This pattern has a very, very simple technique for finishing the neckline, and it doesn't require a band, it doesn't require binding or any other pattern pieces. There's no facing or anything like that. Instead, the Lotus's neckline is finished by simply folding the edge over and top stitching. It is easy peasy. And it really is, except that you're going to want to give a little bit of extra attention to your process here. And so to get that, really nicely crisp finished neckline, I would suggest using a hem tape or something like a Wonder Tape just to give a little bit more crispness to your neckline fold. And that can make a really, really big difference. And I highly recommend following the pattern directions and using a strip of interfacing right at the centers on both sides. And another tool that I use sometimes to get a really nice, crisp, very orderly neckline is that Sew Line glue stick, and then just use a ruler and a marking tool to make sure everything is perfectly lined up. Also, keep in mind that while you're ironing the neckline over and creasing it in place, and of course installing that patch of interfacing, you won't actually sew the neckline down until after you have done the twist and sewn the back piece to the front at the shoulders. So don't get ahead of yourself and sew down that neckline before you've attached those other pieces. Additionally, especially for that interfacing, keep careful track of which neckline side you are folding and pressing and interfacing. So if you look at this image, one side has the neckline folded and interfaced on one side of the fabric, and then on the other side, it is prepared exactly in the opposite direction. So again, that twist is going to make that part feel confusing. So just remember that warning, especially if you are using a double-sided fabric. And now the third piece of important to know info before you sew your own Lotus Blossom blouse. Let's talk about doing the actual twist. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think videos maybe sometimes are worth 1,000,000. So in a second, I'm going to show you the twist actually being done. The twist is my absolute favorite part of this entire pattern. And I think that this particular technique is such a cool way to create this feature. And actually, I've heard several people say that once they saw it and they understood it, they realized that it was actually the easiest version of a twist that they had ever seen before in a sewing pattern. So we just have to wrap our minds around it and trust the process. Before we jump in, let's take a lay of the land for this pattern piece. So if you take a look at this big, huge, long pattern piece, we've got the neckline right here, and it's folded under on that side, and they've put a piece of interfacing there to keep everything nice and sturdy. And if you look at the other side of the pattern piece, you can see that I've done exactly the opposite thing on the other side. So the neckline is folded down and I've put the interfacing down, and it's just exactly on the opposite side of the fabric. So I am using a double-sided piece of fabric here. Now, the other thing you'll see is those markings that are on the pattern piece. Those markings are very important. So we need to set those off so that we can clearly see them throughout this whole process, because those markings are going to match up with each other. So make sure to mark those very, very, very clearly. Now, the other part that I like to mark for myself is this point here. At both sides of the pattern, the points that are here are going to really be important later in the process. So I like to give myself a marker there so I can get to them easily in the future. So the next step I'm going to do is to look at these lines from the top of the neckline down to that first mark, and then on the opposite side, I'm going to take a look at that carefully as well. Those two sections have to meet up with each other. So I'm going to grasp the neckline point on one side and the marked pinned piece, and I am going to meet that line up with the other coordinating side. And you'll notice I grab that sleeve up as well, just to make everything a little easier. So I'm meeting those two lines up together from the top of the neckline down to the marked spot. So now I'm just going to kind of get these all aligned together and pin them in place. You might need to kind of like shake it out a little bit to get everything kind of organized here. And so there's no gaps or puckers or anything. You don't want to pull or stretch anything. You just kind of want to gently release the fabric. So I need to pin this entire line from the top of the neckline at that V point down to the marked area. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm just going to put a bunch of clips here. Now I need to make sure I keep track of that last marked point there, because that's where I'm going to stop sewing. So I need to really make sure that I keep track of where that marking still is. So I'm going to take this back over to my sewing machine and sew all the way down this line from the top of the V down to the last marked spot. So it kind of looks like a mess, like this whole bundled up area back here. It just kind of feels like, what in the world is happening here? But just trust the process and we'll tackle that in a second. So let's go get this sewn. Okay, so I've sewn that straight line of stitching just with my regular sewing machine down to that marked spot from the top of the neckline. I've still got those big giant clips in place to mark the bottom of the hemline. And I'm just going to open everything up. Now it still looks a little weird at the bottom, but give it a second. Let's straighten everything out so we can see what's going on here. Straighten out the neckline, make sure everything's in place, everything's met up together correctly. Kind of flip this out a little bit. And now what we're going to do is look at the bottom of the hemline and grab on to those big giant clips that I use to mark those points down at the bottom of the hemline. So again, this looks a little messy still, but let's just wait for it with those big clips that we're going to pull. So pull both sides of them, and you'll see that you get a nice clean twist together. This is what the intended front of the blouse is going to look like when you're using a double-sided piece of fabric. You'll see that I've got that line of stitching going down the center to connect the two pieces together, but this is all just one big piece of fabric. Now, let me just show you by moving this up a little bit. Let me show you what that bottom piece looks like once we open it all up. I would suggest basting that center seam first, just to make sure you've got everything lined up. And then after you've done that, you're going to press open that center seam for a nice crisp edge. And then you'll notice at the bottom of basically the hemline of the shirt is all finished, and you'll just need to sew the side seams, add in the armbands, sew down the neckline, and then you're done. So there's 3 things that you needed to know before tackling the Lotus Blossom Blouse sewing pattern. It's not too hard, right? I can't wait to see what you sew up. So go ahead and grab that pattern and use the link below to get it on sale from May 19th through the 21st for just $5 in honor of its re-release. Be sure to check back every Friday because we always have a $5 pattern for you to pick up and add to your sewing collection. And we also bring you even more sewing resources so that you can make the most of your precious sewing time. Next up, all of the tester versions and the sizing details for Lotus Blossom Blouse. Happy sewing!